Welcome in Movie Podcast. Today we will talk about if the awards and box office profits mutually exclusive for horror movies. Georgina Campbell Barbarian Oscars. The 95th Academy Awards is a chance for Hollywood to celebrate the best of 2022 in Oscar bait films, big box office films, and, in some cases, films that are both. But not horror films. If you're a fan of the horror movie genre and plan on watching the Oscars hoping to see one of your favorite 2022 horror films get some recognition, don't waste your time. There is not a single nomination in any category for any horror film whatsoever. No X, no Prey, no Barbarian. The long-gestating Mad God doesn't earn a nod for Best Animated Film, and nothing to laud the outrageously bloody Terrifier 2. Even the Razzies have largely overlooked the genre this year, with Morbius the only horror nominee, and if you've seen Morbius, you know horror is appropriate on many levels. But does it matter? No, it does not. For a horror film, awards and box office profits are two mutually exclusive beasts. Horror movie fans are different. The ardent cinephiles of the world know the films that are nominated for Oscars and the reasons why, from subtleties in performances to cinematography that captures the imagination, the nuances that speak to the quality of a film. Casual movie fans appreciate when their favorite films get a nod for anything, like Top Gun, Maverick for Best Sound. Horror movie fans couldn't care less. By and large, the horror movie fan wants two expectations met: scariness and gore. If the movie meets those expectations, then that movie is rewarded at the box office. To varying degrees, of course, films like The Conjuring succeed with the horror movie fan because their lack of gore is more than made up by the effectiveness of their scares. It's said that horror movies are critic-proof, and there is truth to that. As a genre, the horror film has a preset group of fans that will see a horror film just because it's a horror film. Whether it's actually good on a technical level, or the acting is brilliant, or the script is killer, no pun intended, is largely irrelevant, therefore any awards are irrelevant by default. Conventional films don't have that same base to launch from, and are much more susceptible to critic or peer reviews. It's arguably why studios push for franchises, an attempt to mimic the baseline of a horror film by getting moviegoers attached to the next franchise project, but even that isn't foolproof, as the tepid response to the MCU's critically derided Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania would attest to. Horror movie creators know it, too. Armed with that knowledge, the creative forces behind horror movies know they don't have to try all that hard to make a successful film. That's not to say that horror movie creators don't try. Auteurs like James Wan and Jordan Peele have made serious impacts in the genre with their works, but when a critically savaged film like Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey makes over 7 times its budget on its opening weekend, it becomes harder to argue that quality counts for much as far as horror films go. The difference becomes obvious when one looks at how studios promote horror films over conventional films. To push a normal movie, studios weigh heavily on things like critic reviews, award nominations, who is in the film or even who made it, often as flying text interspersed with scenes from the film. You can see it now, EW claims, Oscar bait IV, with Academy Award nominee Meryl Streep is the greatest film ever made, 5 stars out of 4 inches in gold Arial font flying across the screen. Horror movies, on the other hand, push how scary or bloody the film is, speaking to the expectations of the fanbase as described above. The goal, then, of a horror movie director isn't prestige, but how effective they can be in scaring the living shit out of you. Horror movies are conditioned to keep awards and box office apart. The glaring truth is that Hollywood, and more specifically the Academy, have conditioned the fans and creators of horror movies to keep awards and box office mutually exclusive. For horror movies to date, only The Silence of the Lambs has won Best Picture at the Oscars, and 1973's The Exorcist was the first horror film to even be nominated for Best Picture 45 years into the institution. Overall, there have only been 6 horror films to be nominated for Best Picture consideration. One can't base the success of a horror movie on how many awards it's nominated for or how many it wins, because history has overwhelmingly proven that even classics of the genre, Psycho or The Shining, are repeatedly overlooked. Why put the time and energy into crafting an Oscar-worthy horror film when there's only the slightest chance it would even be nominated, if acknowledged at all? It becomes more worthwhile for horror movie creators to see if they can find a premise that results in an even higher box office return. The Blair Witch Project, the granddaddy of found-footage horror films, made $245 million on a $60,000 budget, a return of $408,233. 33%. It's a best-case scenario where the combination of a new premise and scariness catapulted the film over and above its peers at the box office. Worst-case scenario. You're easily making your budget back and probably even more. The Silence of the Lambs did prove that awards and box office can play together in the horror sandbox, and it absolutely deserved its success on both sides. Most would agree, though, that the film is an anomaly in the horror genre, with its plaudits earned by skewing closer to crime thriller than outright horror. The funny thing is, if you were to ask anyone on the street about the film, they are more likely to talk about Hannibal Lecter, Anthony Hopkins, than the awards that it won.
Horror is a very unique genre.
So you can keep your Academy Awards. We'll add our ante to the Scream Vi box office jackpot.